This is a recording of our recent training, which we called Play with a Difference. It's part of a bit of a series that we've been doing, looking at the foundations for successful inclusion, and the other training in the series that you can find on this channel and on our SLA Online link are enabling environments, building attachment, sensory processing, and challenging behaviour. And now we've arrived at Play with a Difference, recognising and celebrating progress for children with SEND. So questions that we've answered in the previous sessions that you might want to revisit are: how can we adapt our environment and staffing to meet SEND needs in enabling environments? How can we settle children in our settings when they don't seem to feel safe with us in building attachment? How can we provide for their sensory needs in sensory processing? And where to start with challenging behaviour in our behaviour session. But the question that we addressed on this training is a question that I seem to be asked even by practitioners who seem quite confident in providing for children with SEND, seem to be quite confident in the environment, in building attachments with children, in providing for sensory needs, and even in managing behaviour. And yet these same practitioners quite often say to me something along the lines of, we're just not really quite sure that we are the right place for this child to make progress in. So that was the question that I wanted to address in this piece of training. In order to begin to feel our way towards an answer to that question, I took us all the way back to our training as early years practitioners and back to Jean Piaget and his stages of cognitive development. So I've set them out on the slide here, but we're only really going to concern ourselves with the first two: sensory motor, which Piaget put as between birth and 2 years old, where you have a young child learning very much through their senses, communicating non-verbally, and then moving on to the pre-operational stage, which takes place between 2 and 7 years, where children are beginning to test things out. Their language is developing and they're learning to talk, and they're beginning to imagine, to have imaginary worlds or ways of looking at activities and toys. We had a look at Piaget's theory of play. I promise there's a reason for this, and there is a purpose that relates to our question. We looked at sensory motor play, which is essentially, what is this object like? So it sits within the sensory motor stage of birth to 2 years and takes place within babies of sort of 5 to 10 months, where they are intentionally mouthing, feeling, banging, shaking, physically experiencing objects and their environment. And then, according to Piaget, play moves on to a constructive play. What can I do with this object from about 10 to 20 months? So it sits within sensory motor stage or early pre-operational stage of cognitive development. And it's very much that posting, rolling, filling, piling, emptying stage, where as a parent your house is a complete mess because everything's been tipped out or posted into places it shouldn't be. And then, still within the pre-operational stage, from 20 months plus, children moving towards imaginative and fantasy play. What can I do with this object? And this is very much where more there's more control over speech, more words are being put together. There's more ability to express these things as well, both to adults and to one another. And then, still within the pre-operational stage of 2 to 7 years, I actually think this stage goes on and on. Children learning the games with rules play. So 3 years, you're going to have a very early level of this, and then it's going to develop and complexify. But children are going to begin to play games with rules, so play with one another at either formal games or games with kind of unspoken rules. But they need to have language skills and cognitive ability to kind of grasp what these games are about, self-regulation to kind of manage themselves within these games. So it's really quite a challenging level of play. Now, this poster is so inspirational, I think, to us as early years practitioners, with the amazing quote from Maria Montessori, Play as Children's Work, and just showing us all the different things that children are doing as they play, developing communication skills, cognitive skills, social skills, extending their thinking, problem solving, all of these different things that they're doing as they play. And yet, this poster doesn't seem to leave a lot of room for children who are at the sensory motor stage of play or the constructive stage of play as an ongoing level of development. It seems to point us as practitioners towards viewing play as more the kind of play that sits within those later stages. I'm sure implicit within this poster is the early stages of play being just as valuable. That's not really what the pictures are pointing to. And you often find this with these sorts of images. And I think as practitioners, we can absorb this a little bit. And when we value learning through play, we might be unconsciously valuing those later stages that Piaget talks about rather than the earlier ones. And I think that's a challenge then when we receive children into our settings who might be 2 or they might be 3, they might be older, and they are still at those early stages of play, the sensory motor or the constructive stages of play. And I think it's really hard for us to treat that with the same level of value because it does present us with a challenge. We're including children in classes that contain their peers who are playing a later stage of play. They might be playing games with rules, or they might be playing imaginative play. And within those rooms of our preschools or nurseries, or within those classrooms, we're now including children who are at sensory motor stage or constructive stage. And that worries us. I challenged those in the room to think about how they felt when a child entered their setting or their classroom who is at this really different level of development, very different from what might be expected by the EYFS age and stage that they're working within, or the baseline assessment that they're just about to do. And just challenge them to think about the fact that that's going to lead us into a deficit model of looking at children. So really looking at children and thinking what they can't do rather than what they can do. The quote that I've put here, for some children within the SEND population, their developmental stages are significantly different from their mainstream peers. Acknowledging this is vital. Seeking a norm referenced approach, e.g. the EYFS to assessment, can lead to professionals adopting a deficit model of what the child cannot do. That's a quote from this document. This is the Celebratory Approach to Send Assessment in the Early Years, which is a document referenced in the EYFS, and it was brought out by the DFE in 2018. And it's a really different way of looking at children's play and learning and celebrating small steps of development. I think that it's a document that we can be far more aware of than we are at the moment, to give us the confidence that for children with SEND, we need to be really looking at their individual development and their individual learning style primarily as we're working with them. So this is a really interesting quote from the document. When considering some assessment tools, there's a danger that we focus on the role of the adult rather than on the development of the child. Meeting support needs is important, but it can't replace our observation and analysis of a child's development. So my question to those who came on the training was, how would it actually feel if we could focus on what a child with additional needs is able to do, rather than what they're not able to do, what they are choosing to do, rather than what they're not choosing to do? And then we thought about the barriers to that. Some of the barriers that came up really related to the challenges of including a child at a sensory motor stage of play or constructive stage of play within a class of peers who are the imaginative play or the games with rules play. But I think everybody agreed that so long as we have the staffing, the people in our team who can spend that time with the child, actually realising where they are in their development and using that as our starting point, is much the best thing to do. And from there we went on to look at schematic play. So this is another Piaget concept, but it's been developed by lots of different people in the years since Piaget first talked about it. And Chris Athey is one of the key people who has related schematic play to young children, defining schemas as patterns of behaviour and thinking in children's play. And the EYFS refers to schematic play as patterns of repeated actions and behaviours that can be observed in young children's play as they make sense of the world around them, and talks about the powerful role of schematic play. We thought about schemas that we observe in children in our settings, observing sucking and mouthing as a schema, trajectory, dropping and throwing things, positioning, grouping and lining up, or enveloping, wrapping things up, rotating, playing with anything circular, or connecting or transforming. So we talked about what we do when we recognise a schema, when we recognise that a child is really motivated to do certain things over and over again. And essentially what we came up with is we want to join them in that schema. That's the way that we can best support them, so that we're starting from their development, what they are doing, rather than what they're not doing. And from there we discussed joint attention. So attention had come up as something that people wanted me to talk about. And I think what the motivation for that was, people wanting to know how to best support children's attention skills to adult tasks, adult initiated tasks. And what I wanted to point out was that it's going to be impossible to do that, to support that kind of attention, if a child has yet to develop joint attention. So joint attention should emerge at around 9 months and be well established by 18 months. But for our children with SEND, it often hasn't. And joint attention is when two people are focusing on a toy or an activity together. So it isn't just that single track attention of a child on a toy or an activity where they're not looking up, they're completely absorbed by that thing and they're not paying any attention to what's going on around them. It's not that. It's where an adult and a child, or two children, but in this instance, an adult and a child, are paying attention to the same thing and they are checking in on each other. So they are both looking at the toy or activity and then looking up at one another to check on the other person's responses, to share the pleasure of what's going on. It might be a cause and effect toy, maybe a jack-in-a-box about to jump up. And as it does so, the child might look up at the adult to see what the adult's reaction is. And the adult would be looking at the child to see what their reaction is. So it's like that picture. It's going around in a little bit of a triangle. And then just coming to the end of the session, I was pointing towards this really useful tool that's been developed by the brilliant Dingley's Promise and has been put onto the DFE website. And this is the link for it. It's a number of assessment sheets in the different areas, in some different areas of development: communication and interaction, cognition and learning, social and emotional, and sensory and physical. And This is a snapshot from the communication and interaction sheet, and you can see how small the steps are. And then even within each step, you're tracking whether a child's skills are emerging, supported or independent. So I think these are a really useful tool in not only recognising the development that the children are already displaying, but also recognising their small steps of progress, so that really as practitioners, we can feel reassured that we are settings that children can make progress within. So in summary, we started with the question, can we be the right place for a child with SEND to make progress? And we've considered the stages of play. So we went back to Piaget and recognised that children might be coming into our settings at the sensory motor or constructive stages of play, so very early stages of play. And the right thing to do is to recognise where their development is sitting. We've considered joining children in their schemas as a way of facilitating joint attention, which is a real starting point for everything else we need to build. And we've looked at a way of recording progress. So I hope that that has left you feeling more confident that your setting can be a place where a child with SEND can make progress. And I hope that you'll join us for our next training.